Hello everyone and welcome to this Care Experience History Month event. My name is Dee Michelle. I'm an academic at the University of Adelaide and I'm also a former foster child. I'd like first to acknowledge and pay my respect to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians of the ancestral lands on which I live. I acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country and respect and value their past, present and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. Care Experience History Month 2022 builds on the first ever Care Experience History Month last year. It was the initiative of Who Cares Scotland, a Scottish organisation working with care experience young people and care leavers across Scotland. By care experience, we mean people whose childhoods have been disrupted or interrupted by being orphaned, by being abandoned by parents, by being removed from parents by the state. In Australia, we often think of care experience people in different terms, such as stolen generations, former child migrants, forgotten Australians, care leavers, people who've been in out-of-home care, GOM kids. Tonight, we are privileged to have 4 writers who have written about their disrupted childhoods: Kate Shayler, Frank Golding, Denise Brooks and Tracie Oldham. Each writer is going to speak with us about their writing journey, benefits, challenges, etc., and then we'll open up to questions and comments. We'll begin with Kate Shayler. Kate Shayler went to a home when her mother died. Kate was 4 years old and she lived in the home until she was 16. Her father visited regularly and she went to live with him when she left the home and worked as an insurance clerk. She stayed in that job until she became so utterly bored that she took up the suggestion of friends to get her HSC and see where that took her. In 1974, Kate began a university degree and became a teacher. This wasn't how she thought her life would go. What about the marriage and the family she had learned to expect? Years later, Kate began to receive counselling and addressed many issues that she knew were lurking or leaking inside her somewhere. These included the effects of sexual assault by her father, a lack of self-esteem engendered in the home, and the belief that she was ugly and not very bright. In 1993, Kate met Dave and he became her partner in 1994. Her most treasured friend suggested to Kate that she write her story, and eventually she did. The Long Way Home became a bestseller when it was published by Random House. Since then, Kate has written a sequel, a collection of home kids' stories, and biographies of 2 men whose lives were severely influenced by their being recruited as children by pedophiles. With the recent death of her beloved Dave, Kate is having a break from writing. Welcome, Kate.
Hello, I'm Kate, and I am today what I never thought would be possible. I'm a writer. I grew up in Burnside Homes in Western Sydney, and it was quite close to the notorious Parramatta Girls' Home, and any time we got too naughty, we were threatened with being sent to Parramatta Girls' Home, which was a very scary prospect. And it also shows that people knew what was going on there, but it wasn't ever made public until recently, of course. Anyway, I went to Burnside because my mother died and my father had to keep working to support me and my brother and sister. And for the whole 12 years that I was in Burnside, all I really wanted was for my mother to come back and love me. So one day I disclosed what the staff should have recognised as a sexual abuse, but they didn't. Instead, they said that I was a dirty, filthy child who no one else should play with or talk to. So that really increased my loneliness and my desperate need to be loved. Even spoken to would have helped. I struggled at school too. I was a really bad reader and a terrible writer, which is why the fact that I'm a writer today is the impossible come true. So I used to choose the fattest books in the library and pretend to be reading them. And once I chose one that was about 450 pages. It was called Across Texas. And then you had to write a review. And I knew that you had to express your opinion in a book review. So I wrote something like, "The cowboys fell into rattlesnake pits and got bashed up a lot, but he got out all right and he kept riding across Texas." And that was the end of my review. And part of it was because I had no critical thinking skills, because in the home, you just had to do what you were told and not ask questions and just keep on doing the work that you were told to do, which was scrubbing and polishing floors and peeling mounds of potatoes and pumpkins and mending clothes and all sorts of things that most children, I think, did not do. And when we did compositions at school, mine were always failures too, because kids in the real world used to go on holidays away from their home, or they'd go to movies or parks or somewhere to have fun. And we just stayed in the same old drudge and did the same old things. And I remember a teacher in primary school said, well, come on, just use your imagination. And I didn't know what there was to imagine about, to write a composition about. So that was no help to me at all. There was also the issue that in the home, you learnt to be ashamed of being a homes kid. You never talked about it outside the home. And you learnt that you were a lesser being than the other kids at school. And I was also very self-conscious about needing glasses, being fat after I reached puberty, being ordinary at school, and all sorts of things. My self-confidence was extremely low, shall we say. So I stayed there in that environment until I was 16. Then I had to leave so I could get a job to help support my father and my sister, who was still at school. And I went to live with my father, who had been my abuser, so that didn't work out so well anyway. But gradually I started to meet the most wonderful people, and I have always felt grateful that they were my guides through my life when I didn't know anything, and they gave me really good solid advice and loved me and cared for me and so on. And so gradually I started telling them about my life in Burnside, and the first story I told them was that God made Sunday afternoons just so that small children could sit on the floor and pick up toilet paper in squares, 3 at a time, and fold them carefully together and put them in a prune tin, an empty tin that was bigger than the little baked bean tin, so that we could not have more than 3 squares of toilet paper when we went to the loo. So my friends just absolutely roared laughing at that, because one was a minister of religion, and so he thought that was very funny. And he and his wife said, oh, you've got to write that down, that is so good. Nobody else would know anything about that. So they kept encouraging me to write my story, and I wasn't very interested in writing my story because I'd lived it, and who would care anyway. So gradually I told them more and more, and they kept saying, write it, write it, write it. So I was still an insurance clerk at that stage, so I wrote my whole story, my whole 23 years, I think it was then, in 15 exciting pages. And I gave it to them and said, there you are, I've done it. And they said, very interesting, but we think there's more to it than that. So by the time we got to that stage, I'd started doing uni, because my reading had improved by then, so had my writing. But I didn't want to spend time on my story because I was, working really hard to get through uni. And then I became a teacher, and during my teaching career, I had an issue with one staff member that I just did not know how to address. And so I went to see a psychologist who followed the role that my father played, and he abused me. So I reported him and he was struck off. But thank goodness, because that happened, I met a fantastic psychologist who was really, really helpful. She taught me to see myself in a different light and to see my own strengths, and to see reasons to be proud of decisions and achievements that I'd had in my life. And that was, it was just amazingly helpful to have a different way of looking at a person who I thought was a failure, really. And so my confidence grew yet again. And then I met my lovely husband, Dave, who's recently died, and I miss him terribly, as you might imagine. And would you believe that he grew up in Burnside too? And that's how our conversation with each other began. And eventually I moved in with him, and he said, you know what? I'd like to give you a year off work so that you can write this story, because he wanted it written too. So I said, oh, all right, if you insist, please insist. So I took a year off, and my daily routine would be to get up, have breakfast, start writing, have a cuppa, write again till lunchtime, have lunch, and then write again till the end of the day. But I never left my writing at a place where I didn't know where to go the next day. I always knew when I walked in the room the next day, I would start here and off I would go. So I worked really hard that year, and I think I got most of it done. But then it was time to go back to work. So I put my writing aside and just embraced my teaching again. And then the term, after term 1 ended, I went back to read my story that I'd written so far, and it was amazingly boring. It was flat and dull, and it had no life or texture or character. It was just, oh dear, unpublishable, I knew. So I went to Dave and said, oh, I'm sorry, dear, but I'm just not a writer. And so he was really disappointed, but he thought, you know, you can't make her do what she doesn't want to do. And then a light went on in my head, and I had a different idea for how to do it. And so I thought, yes, I'll try doing what I did in therapy with the good therapist, which was to talk in first person, present tense, about what the subject of the day was. And so I started to do that, and I felt that it was working. So at the end of each school day and between terms and so on, I would write again in that mode. And Dee asked us to talk about what challenges there were in writing and the rewards and benefits as well. So there were many challenges, and these are some of them. What would my brother and sister say about what I was writing? So I asked them, and they both said, yeah, do it. So I did, and my sister read it when it was finished, and she sat and cried and read and chain smoked, and, you know, it's a surprise the Fire Brigade wasn't called, because she was so upset by what I was writing. But at the end of it, she said, that's got to be put out there so people will know. And my brother, on the other hand, said, nah, I know what happened. Yeah, I don't need to read it. And I knew that he didn't know everything about it, because he didn't know about the sexual abuse from our dad. And then I thought, oh, what am I going to do? I said, okay, so I'll just put that aside and think about that later. Another challenge was whether to use the real names of people in my writing, because I was saying very awful things about very awful people, and I didn't want especially to be sued. So I decided I rang someone at the ABC, and he gave me some advice which was more confusing than helpful. But the bottom line was that telling the truth was no defense, and it was a little bit dangerous to write the truth about people using their real names. So I decided that I would change everybody's name who I was writing derogatory comments about. But if I was writing nice positive comments, I would use their real names. So, so my best example of derogatory comments is a lady called Miss Keats. So I changed her to Miss Yates. So every time I read about her, I would go, yep, Keats, Yates, poets, I know who that is. Not that I didn't know, but it helped a bit anyway. So changing the names was my way around that. And my brother actually rang me and said, you can write your story, but don't write it in your real name, because I don't want everyone to know it's me, because our surname is a recognisable name, Cave, if you want to know. So he said, make up some name. So I did. And that was quite hard because our real names all start with J, so I had to find 3 names that all started with the same letter, could be abbreviated to a recognisable name as well, and so on and so on. So anyway, I got around that using a dictionary of names. And I was really worried that because I was writing such awful stuff, I might get too upset and I might not be able to stop crying. And I got over that by saying, okay, well, I'll just cry and talk with Dave, and then it will be done and I'll be able to put it aside. So I did quite a bit of crying while writing. Another challenge was, what if Burnside decides to sue me? I could end up living in a tent for the rest of my life. But I decided, well, I'm going to tell the truth, and everybody wants me to put it out there, so I'll just do it. And I had this vague worry, challenge, whatever, about maybe I won't get a publisher, but I didn't really actually believe I'd get one. So that was just a small little challenge for me. And along with all those challenges, there came rewards. And one of them was that I felt that I was understanding myself much better, because I remembered good decisions that I'd made, as my therapist had said, and I had a broader picture of where I'd grown up and its circumstances, and I was able to think about that much more critically than I had been when I was living there. And so that gave me a better understanding of how my childhood affected me as an adult, and it affected my fears and my attitudes and beliefs about myself and the world in general. So that was a really big reward for me. And another reward was that I remembered really lovely things that had happened to me as a child, and those things had got clouded over by the darkness of my childhood. So, for example, I remembered our lovely Nana, who was no relation at all, and she used to have us to her place, and we used to play with her dog, and Nana and her dog, as well as my father, were the people who loved us kids most in our childhood. So it was a very lovely thing to revisit Nana. Some of the rewards came after the book was published, and I might talk about those a little bit later. So I've talked about the process of writing, but I have to say that I also found doing a writing course was really good, because it gave me confidence and gave me some techniques to use. The technique that I used most, which fitted really well with my first person present tense, was show people what happened, don't tell them. So you don't say, so I went upstairs and I was really angry. You would say, I stamped up the stairs with my fist clenched, and that kind of thing. So you don't just say that's what happened. You show the emotion and so on by words. And rewards. Well, the best rewards came after I got published and people started writing saying, thank you so much for that book. We had no idea that people lived in places like that in Australia. And I don't think a lot of people did know, because other homes kids have told me that people don't believe them when they tell what happened to them in the homes and how they lived. But I think now that we're writing our stories, people know that it's true. But I have to say the best rewards came from other homes kids who wrote to me, because they said, thank you for giving us a voice. Because even if we can't talk about our stories yet, we can say, read that, that's what happened to me. And I found that just more rewarding than anything else could be. And one letter that I got's a bit funny. A girl wrote and she said, oh, Burnside, my mum grew up there. Now I understand why she's so weird. And I remembered her mum, and she was bullied mercilessly because she had, her mother had sent her Spencers to keep her warm, and the Spencers used to show below her school shirts. So she was teased mercilessly. So anyway, lots of rewards, but those letters from Home's kids were the best. And at a reunion, which we have once a year, someone said to me, "Hey, you can write. Why don't you write my story?" And then other people would say, "Yeah, why don't you write mine and mine and mine and mine?" So I thought, yep, I could spend the rest of my life writing people's stories, but I do want to have another life as well. So I did a tour of Eastern Australia, and I collected people's stories on a voice recorder, and I published them in a book that's called Burnished. And the people and their families were mostly quite old and wanted some record of their stories. So it was very special to them to have their stories told. But publishers weren't interested in an anthology of stories unless the people were noteworthy people like film stars, actors, politicians. So we weren't noteworthy enough, so we self-published that book, and it didn't go very far because we don't have the distribution networks that publishers have. But I just would really like to say to publishers, we are noteworthy people, and the sooner you recognise that, the better. You will have millions, or thousands anyway, of fabulous stories coming your way to publish. So we are noteworthy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. Next up, we've got Frank Golding. Between the ages of 2 and 15, Frank was a ward of the state of Victoria and lived in 3 homes and 3 foster families. As an adult, he worked as a teacher, school principal, policy officer, and academic. Frank is an honorary research fellow at Federation University Australia, where in 2021 he completed a PhD entitled Care Leavers, Recovering Voice and Agency Through Counter-Narratives. Frank has contributed to formal inquiries dealing with the institutionalisation of children and to projects with the National Museum, the National Library of Australia, and the National Summit on Rights in Records. He has presented papers on child welfare in a number of countries and has written more than a dozen books, as well as many book chapters and referee journal articles. Frank is a life member of CLAN and was awarded an Order of Australia Medal in 2018 for, and I'm quoting, service to child welfare and social justice and to the community. Welcome, Frank.
Thank you very much, Dee, and I'm so pleased to be here in the company of the other writers, and I particularly like Kate's speech, if I can call it that. I read the book a long time ago, Kate, and I read it again this week, and I see more in it this time than I did those years ago, so it's a fabulous book. Now, let me talk about myself as a writer. I have 3 main ideas when I write. The first is the purpose. Knowing why I'm writing is very important. And the second is the audience, knowing who would want to read it. And the third is the crafting of it, the actual writing of it. How do you connect with readers? And tonight I just want to concentrate on the first 2, the purpose and the readers, and not the how of actually writing, although I'd be interested in some discussion about that when we get time. If you've been commissioned to write a book, and I've been commissioned a number of times to write a book or a chapter or an article, a lot of the hard work's been done for you because the commissioning editor will tell you what they want, who it's for, and so on. And they might negotiate the content, but basically all the big decisions are already made. Now, care leavers don't get that kind of offer very often, and certainly not to write about care leaver matters. As Kate has said, it's difficult enough to get published, let alone to be commissioned by a publisher in advance. So the big questions about why you're writing and who your readers are, and they're open to your own answers. And I've read many books. I think, Dee, you said at the beginning, there were many, many books published. I think I've got a list of about 150 books written by care leavers. So it's a very wide range of types of books that people have been writing. There are many stories which seem to me to be therapeutic or personally cathartic, written for that purpose. And I recall when the Senate Forgotten Australians report came out in 2004, many people are actually, they said, telling their stories for the first time ever to anybody, let alone their own family. So what you said before, Caroline, sorry, I had to struggle with remembering your name. Caroline, what you said before is quite common. People don't tell their story until there's a pressing necessity or urgent need to do so. And the committee, the Forgotten Australians Committee, said that there were people desperately wanting to tell their story in 2004, and they told them to that Senate inquiry. Some of those people I know, there were 600 odd people who gave evidence at that inquiry. Some of those people have actually written their accounts, notably for family members and for their own children. I've had a number of people say, I want to write down what happened to me so that my children will know in the years to come. Some also write for other care leavers, and their response is often very warm. For example, Al Fletcher, I don't know whether you know Al's book, Brutal, Surviving Westbrook Boys Home. He was asked the question, why did you write this? And he said, it did a lot of good for the families that didn't understand their father and the children. It did a lot of good for the children of these people from Westbrook, because naturally the families couldn't understand their father. So that was his motivation. And Kevin Swift, who was a former inmate of Westbrook, thoroughly agreed. He said, I'm one of the boys that it helped. I'm an old boy now, but my family is a very extended family. I've got 11 brothers and 4 sisters and many nephews and nieces. They all didn't understand me as their father or uncle or anything. They do now because they've read that book. I can attest to similar reactions from scores of former inmates of the institution featured in my memoir, which is the Ballarat Orphanage, although 1 or 2 readers thought I included content that was a bit unpleasant, and I was a bit unkind to the adults who looked after us. Like many other Australian children, my life was changed forever when I was separated from my parents as a 2-year-old. I was charged at the Children's Court, as many of us were, with the offence of being a neglected child. At one point, I was discharged on probation to my mother and recommitted when that failed on the charge of being without sufficient means. And finally, at the age of 15, after 4,397 days in out-of-home care, I was discharged. That was the language in my file. In all those years, I was never once told why I was in care, though I was in an orphanage, but I had parents. How can you be in an orphanage if you've got parents? Nobody in those 4,000 days and nights ever bothered to sit down and explain it to me. And so I felt absolutely abandoned and a sense of total puzzlement about what I was doing there and when it would end. Indeed, if it would end, but it did eventually. So I had this inexplicable upbringing and I needed to understand why that happened to me. And what's more, I needed to understand, I needed to be able to tell my children who asked these questions, you know, why were you in an orphanage when your parents, and they'd met my parents, why grandfather and grandmother seemed perfectly ordinary people to me. So there's the motivation of why I needed to write that story. So the scabs just didn't stop itching. And eventually I found the time to do the writing. But first of all, I had to do the research. And I spent probably several years probing in, first of all, in the censored welfare documents. I never got anything that didn't have blacked out sentences or paragraphs. In libraries, archives, newspapers, police and military records. My father was involved in both those, and court reports, swapping memories with my brother, talking to others with similar care experiences. I eventually made that story into my book, An Orphan's Escape, Memories of a Lost Childhood, published in 2005 and sold out completely. But I found I was actually more than just satisfaction in writing the story, finding out what the story was and then writing about it. I knew there was always more to it, the story. There was more than one layer. There was, of course, this sort of narrative. You go from 2-year-old to 15 and you can sort of tell a story which is chronological, but there were other layers to this story. And there were shocks and revelations along the way. I must say my father's police record is extraordinary, and his military record perhaps even more extraordinary. So there were those shocks, and I've included some of that in the book. But there were other issues that you grapple with, like how reliable is your memory? When my brother, who I hadn't seen for 23 years, when my brother and I got together, his memory was fantastic, much better than mine. And why is it some things stick in your mind and other things come back into your mind only when somebody else reminds you of it? And there was the issue of how you interpret the experiences. And we can write about the experiences, but what they actually mean. How do you make sense of those experiences? So I found these layers of meaning in the book. There was me as the child of a lost family, and what relationship I had with my parents subsequent to being out of the home, and myself as a child among 200. I mean, how can you grow up with 200 children and not be shaped by the system that you live in? And like Kate, one of the biggest surprises was actually getting feedback from readers. And some of the readers gave me some fantastic feedback. I'd mentioned that I never knew much about my parents and they wouldn't tell me much. In fact, they were closed to any explanation. I never met my grandfather. I met my grandmother, but never my grandfather. And readers sent me, would you believe, a photo of my grandfather and told me information about him. And that opened up a whole new multi-generational skyscraper of a story, which I've been writing virtually ever since. I'm going to get it published this year, cross fingers. I started with that single search for my grandfather in that book, but in fact, what I found was an extraordinary story of multi-generational incarceration of children. 5 generations, starting in 1865 and down the line, some 30 children in 16 different institutions. What an extraordinary family I come from. And the way in which that story developed from a search for my grandfather, into a totally different understanding of my mother and her mother than I ever imagined was possible. So what I started writing is not what I finished up with at all. And I think that's not uncommon for people. I was also become more conscious that I'm actually writing for a broader audience, a much broader audience. And that comes from the frustration about institutional histories and in-house publications that come out, you know, the story of Burnside or the story of the Ballarat Orphanage or the story of Tirana or whatever, written by people who ran those places or commissioned by people who wrote those places. And I just find those so unsatisfactory. And so I'm very conscious that, in fact, I'm now writing for that much broader audience, which is hopefully changing the nature of the history of out-of-home care so that we understand it from an insider's perspective, from the experience of people who actually lived through that period. And I'm very much driven by the same philosophy that Melissa Lukashenko, who writes about Indigenous writing. She sees it as an act of wresting back some control over the stories previously told about Aboriginal people, being the authors of their own lives. and defining not only their identity, but defining their history and contributing to that history. So if we are to write stories about fractured families and childhood brutality and neglect and trauma and grief and shattered innocence and betrayal of trust, let us be the ones who write them, not the people who so-called looked after us. But also let's be positive and talk about the bouncing back, the resistance and the resourcefulness of many of us who bounced back from those sorts of adversities and vulnerabilities as children and made good against the odds. Mm. So in a sense, I see writing a memoir as an act of resilience, because it demonstrates not only you survived a difficult childhood, but you've developed the confidence and the competence to make a considered statement about that experience and how you survived. And I very strongly encourage all care leavers to put their life story out there as a contribution to that more authentic history from below. I'll stop.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I like that idea of writing as an act of resilience, but also what came to mind is writing as an act of resistance, particularly against some of those other institutional histories that you talked about, Frank.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Can I just make a little comment there?
Sure.
I'll be very brief. A lot of the children from homes are illiterate, and they need people like us to do their stories for them.
Well,
absolutely. Thank you. That's a really excellent point. Thank you.
And I've had that same experience that you had, Kate, of people asking me to write their story.
Yeah.
It's a dilemma because, you know, you want to, but you also want to encourage people to I don't know, build up the skills and resources to do their own story in their own way.
Yep.
We can discuss that later.
We will.
Sorry.
Yeah.
We will. Thank you. Thank you, Frank. And Denise is up next, Denise Brooks. Denise was institutionalised in the Goodwood Orphanage in South Australia when she was 3 years of age. She spent 9 years in the orphanage and has recalled many of her experiences in her published book under the pseudonym J.D. Collier. J.D. Survives the Home of Many Mothers is the name of her book. Denise's professional background is in environmental and public health. She has many qualifications in her field, but her major intellectual pursuits include a Master's of Public Health and a Master's of Creative Writing. Denise spent many years of her life undertaking personal development of various therapies to process her institutional experiences, and this was in an attempt to steer her life onto a more positive track. She has taken a keen interest in accessing artistic modalities to find her hidden voice. Denise wrote a journal for 40 years and in 2001 started writing her book. Then her writing stalled due to being stuck in emotional trauma, and she was only able to complete writing her story when she undertook her Masters of Professional Practice, Creative Writing, after she retired from working in local government. Denise has recently sculpted a nun's face and created a life-size mannequin of a Catholic nun for the Orphanage Museum in Geelong. Welcome, Denise.
Hi, thanks for having me. I've found the speakers very, and really haven't got to know these people before and find out more about them. I really liked Kate's descriptions, and I think that, you know, I probably followed a similar journey to her in my writing, because I too, with like her father, he started writing his in drawings, and so did I. In fact, I've got a whole of drawings here. So, you know, of writing and feelings of what I've written and what I've done. It's all part of my material for my book. So, you know, things, what I wanted. And then one time in my therapy, actually it was in 1998, I did a therapy session you know, I just said, what do I want to do? I want to write these experiences. What do I need to do to know? I discovered the witch, the creator, the wild one, and I wanted to, you know, get that energy, publish my journals. Do I need to get it onto the field? There needed to be a lot of deep diving to do, some personal stuff that I would need a lot of support along the way. So, did you see the pictures of that? Did that show up?
Yep.
Yeah, it did. Okay. Yeah. So, I found that the drawing helped me find the words as well, because although I was always accused of being a chatterbox as a child, I still didn't seem to be able to find the words for the emotional trauma and experience that I had in the orphanage. So I gleaned it from my diaries and from my drawings. You know, it was the drawing that actually inspired me, I suppose, to find the words to articulate in a way that I hadn't been able to before, and express deep, unspoken feelings and words that I couldn't find before. So one of the things in the journal journey of writing also was, you know, like that there's a lot, there's probably 20 years worth of work in that journal I've shown you there. And I've done some sculpting, and I have a whole suitcase of other journals, not pictorial, written journals. And then, of course, then there's all the research that's needed to pull together, like Frank said and Kate said, to actually find, you know, a chronological order for everything. And I was amazed in my therapy, because at times I would find in the therapy sessions that I think to myself, is this really my imagination? Did this really happen this way? Was this timing right? Did that really happen in that way? Was that really my perspective? So Frank said, occasionally I did come across a few other girls that grew up in the orphanage with me. There were 100 girls in our orphanage. It's really interesting how you can grow up with 100 other and really hardly know anything about their lives. So traumatized and insulated in our little cocoon of coping with our own trauma, and also being thrashed and bashed a lot and told that we weren't allowed to talk to each other. And, you know, no time left really to share or talk and about our lives and where we came from or anything. So when I went back, my interesting background was going back to my parents, and like Frank said, mine's obviously not such a long lineage, but then I don't know, because I haven't really gone back far enough, of children being disassociated. I know I've gone back 3 generations. My grandmother was fostered. My mother was also put into orphanages, and then myself and my 2 sisters. So, yeah, so then I also needed to go back and find out more about my mother and why was I in this orphanage. And it had worked out that my mother had mental illness, or categorised as mental illness. I sometimes wonder, you know, mistreated, but they did say that there was organic damage, tests. And I've done a painting around that, because about that my mum was 3 months pregnant with me when she had an epileptic fit, and she was in the Royal Hospital in Victoria, and apparently they didn't know she was pregnant and had proceeded to give her certain drugs and electric treatment, ECT, the treatment, you know, the shock therapy. And then again back in the hospital when she was 8.5 months pregnant with me. She was staring out a window and they thought she was trying to commit suicide. So finding the medical records, I found handy. I found medical records to be closer to being accurate. Also remiss on noticing a lot of the sociological background of family. Like, I mean, my mother was treated as a person with mental illness, and there was a slight mention that she was the mother of 3 children at different points in time. Really holistic treatment of a person as a whole individual. So I found that really difficult. And you see all those gaps in the system of the way they handled people, the way they treated people, which probably gave me my drive to go into public health, because I really felt that I had a feeling for the underdog and the person who was the most socially advantaged, and those that were left between the cracks were usually most affected. And I wanted to speak up for them, and I wanted to challenge the system and make sure that those people, just because they couldn't speak or say or know how to deal with it, that they still had adequate care and health treatment, etc. And of course, you know, my concept of health, of course, is the mental, physical, social, psychological and spiritual aspects of a person. So that became my passion for quite a long time. And then, of course, working in local government, you see a lot of game playing that goes on. You see hierarchical abuse that goes on, institutional. So I often got annoyed because I think, why do I have to always work for an institution? Why do I feel safe working in an institution? I break away and do something by myself and please myself, raise an income that way. I did the safety of working within institutions for quite a long time. And then, of course, after I had, say in 2001, I started to write my book. I had written about 6 words. Much of it was probably repetitive and really good style, but it was original, it was there. And I found also that when I did do research into mental health records and social records and other stuff, I found it was actually a lot better than I realised, that I was actually spot on. And there were different ways of cross-checking dates or incidences that happened in certain years, and following like the Catholic, like which bishop was there at the time, and just a different way to track the records of the information, and to double check and make sure that what I had was correct, it was right, that it wasn't bullshit such. But of course, creative writing, you can embellish if you want to, you can do that. And the interesting thing is when it came time to publish, I felt such a strong urgency, mostly because about the time that all the stuff was coming out about Archbishop Pell and that whole exposure of Catholicism and the church hiding things, that I really just wanted to get my book out there. I haven't approached not one mainstream publisher. I just went straight to publishing my own. And I thought to myself, well, if I publish 1,000 books to start with, attribute those, then hopefully somewhere along the line, if a publisher wanted to, they might pick it up and see it. But, it hasn't really happened, being discovered that much. Of course, once you're published and you're out there, you get chased by a lot of people wanting you money to pay for different products and advertising. And yes, it is difficult to get your books out there, hard copies out there. It's very difficult. My publishers give them sight, and some of my books have been sold that way, but generally you're just open to the sharks, your own effort in getting your book out there. When it came to publishing, I went to Balboa, and I went to them was because they were Hay House. And when I had done a lot of my therapy work, I had done a lot of stuff on Louise Hay and followed a lot of her concepts and a lot of the personal growth who were around at that particular time. So I thought, well, I'd go with them. Anyhow, once I approached them to publish my book, and of course I had to pay for it, they told me that they didn't want me to use my real name, that I wasn't allowed to use my own photo as an author. I wasn't allowed to use any real names in the book, otherwise they couldn't publish it. It really it hurt me, it bothered me. Thought, well, what happened to my authenticity? And then I did still get the book something to offer, and so I did go back and change all the names in the book so that they weren't people, just mix things up. Like my mother's name was Nina, so I made Nina my best girlfriend that was in the orphanage, and Nina now. So I just switched some of the names around, things around, and till it became what you'd call fiction. And I didn't really need to embellish anything much at all. I mean, you can use hyperbole, and you can use a lot of things to exaggerate a situation or underplay a situation, or use space or timing or different things to pace a book out a certain way and to get your story, create the atmosphere that you want the book to create. Like, for instance, in the orphanage, there were many years that go by when you're disassociated, you're anaesthetized, you're just going from one trauma to another, and you have no concept of. There's ways of just making space and things like that to allow that time. And I felt of the nothing, I call them the nothing moments, were really the moments that were the most rich in some ways in terms of psychology and pathology and the effect that happens to children in that time, that disassociation, that thing that you adaptive behavior as you get older, the missing links, the missing points, the reasons that put you in danger again because you're so disassociated from your own body and mind to have coped that you actually tolerated more abuses and more things that happen and develop an excessive tolerance for abuse. I mean, I did also in my book, want to reach out for that creative wild child. So, I'd write about things like the games that we play in the orphanage and different things that we did. And it does actually, by freeing up all those dark parts of your past, it leaves room for you to find the space between the notes. It's the space between the notes that makes the music. And I think that we could make a lot more use of that space that hasn't been filled, that space that hasn't been told. And that's, I believe, is where the richness of the story can be told. The challenges I had was what voice do I use? And I found myself in changing. So I was traumatized at the age of 6, and I'd written 60,000 words, and I decided to go and do a master's in public health. Not public health, the master's in creative writing. I found that I wanted to find that voice, and they kept talking about the voice and Star's voice. I'm thinking, I don't know what my voice is. I know now, it's this Aussie girl who's educated but still talks as if she's not educated, and makes fun of the Aussie language in different ways. And makes blunt statements every now and again, takes the piss out of things because I just want to for the hell of it, because I'm a rebel. And you can enjoy doing all that creative writing. And that's what I had to find and recognise that that I can write from that voice and that I can do that. And it really helped having students and colleagues. When we did our masters, we'd have roundtable discussions, and like we've got now, like there'd be nothing better than us having another roundtable discussion where we could just do the same thing. Like I had 24 other students that we could out and run them by and talk about it and talk about the process. And of course mine was more academically assessed then because it was master's level writing. So it was good though, because I could get that critiquing and that feedback, and it'd say to me, no, I'm sorry, you're trying to write from the inner child, but that doesn't sound very childlike. You're stepping back into your adult. And the hard challenge for me was to stay in the inner child, to actually stay in it. And then I found though, but you get to a certain age where that actually becomes a prison, being in the inner child and that voice, because a child has limited vocabulary. So you have to work out how you grow up, how you words, how you transition that growing up, and yet still stay in the first person. It's very, very challenging to do that kind of writing. And I don't know whether people actually realise just the amount of inner work that's involved with doing that. But anyway, that's what I wanted. I wanted to write from that inner child. And as Frank says, you know, let us be the ones that write and tell the stories. Let us be the one that does it, because we're the ones with the experience. But I wanted to define that experience as it was as a child, so that these welfare people and social workers and teachers and people that make decisions based on a child's life and making decisions for them and being their voice, they're not always correct. They're not always reading the child the right way. They're not always interpreting what's really going on for that child. They often don't have the whole story about impacts of what else is affecting that child, all those layers, more layers than a Sara Lee cake. But you know, that's why it was a challenge to write it from the inner child, and to stay there and to keep writing from it. But then as I got older, it became challenging. I got up to the age of 12, the age I left the orphanage. That's right, that's where my first book is finished. And then I'm about to write my Careless Teens. And like Frank said, you've got to write about why you're writing, who you want to write to. And I've actually found that I wanted a wider audience. When I wrote the book, I have found that my book appeals a lot to people in my generation. But I've also found that it was suitable for children that were younger. They could pick it up and read it. A couple of my young relative children have picked it up and read it, some of my nieces, and they've loved it. And I've said to them, this is your story, this is your family. I know the names are different, but this one here is your auntie, this person here is your grandmother, this person here is this or that. And they've become fascinated and they could read it. And then I also felt that there's a wider audience, again, because I've been working with my therapists, and I'd had different therapists most of my life, and social workers and doctors, and even sold a book to a urologist because I was a bedwetter. So I found that my audience is far wider than I first thought. I've actually started marketing my book on LinkedIn.
Yeah,
so,
fantastic.
You know, targeting those professionals. Yeah.
Excellent. Fantastic. Thank you. That's really, there's so much in there in what you've said. And you mentioned Louise Hay. Did you know that she was in foster care for 2 weeks, and apparently she cried the whole time and got removed?
Oh, there you go, hey?
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. That's excellent. Finally, Tracie Oldham, who is a lived experience survivor, advocate, speaker, and author. Tracie believes that by sharing the horrific story of her own life, she will inspire others to have the confidence to speak openly and freely about their own difficult experiences and help to reduce the shame and stigma surrounding sexual assault, child sexual abuse and rape, domestic violence, etc. Tracie is actively involved in the community and has recently published her memoir, My Shitty Life. Welcome, Tracie.
Thank you for inviting me. I don't actually call myself a writer. What I am is just a narrator of my story that I want to at least have the last word. I wrote a little opening line for my, when I recently wrote a submission, I started it with, when we talk about flaws in the judicial system, nobody needs to look much further than the abysmal treatment I've received and how my entire life has been a miscarriage of justice. I've been poorly treated by the government authorities since birth and no one has ever been held accountable. And I think that's in a nutshell. My book will never be a Pulitzer Prize. It's probably got more grammatical errors than a toilet wall, but it tells a real story about someone that wouldn't give up, though I did many times. And for no fault of her own, it was just incredibly hard. I didn't realise my life was hard because I was living it. It wasn't until I wrote the book that I actually polarised my life and I didn't like what I saw. I didn't like the way that I had allowed things to happen because I was so used to being treated so poorly. It was just part of my makeup. So I wasn't going to write a book. I never ever entertained the idea because it's not something you want out in the public. But somebody mentioned Cardinal Pell, and it was that actually triggered me. Not that I was involved in clergy abuse. I was involved in being sexually abused. That's such a mild word. I was raped. I mean, we need to give it the word that it is. I get tired of people saying child molestation. No, it's child rape. Because I was in voluntary care, which isn't formally recognised by the government. So you just palmed off to different families. I'm not a forgotten Australian. I'm not eligible for national redress. Voluntary placement survivors are nothing. We are not recognised in Australia. And because of that, we were just left to be handed around to families to be treated as and how they wanted. I was, during the Pell trial that was on the news, I happened to look down at my Facebook and noticed it was being lit up like a Christmas tree by hypocritical members of my family that were saying, string the bastard up, anyone that does this to a child, and you could get the picture. These are the same people that knew that I was being systematically raped for years by their own brother. And I just couldn't believe it. So I went to Socket, tried to have him charged. That fell through because of COVID and it just put too much pressure. It just disappeared like thousands of others. And it was then that I realised that something was very wrong, that I was never going to get justice. Sorry, my battery's not right. I've just got to move for 1 second, sorry. I don't think my thing's plugged in. Why is that not working?
We can hear you.
Yes, you're coming across quite clearly.
And I
Here
can
it's saying
see
my
you.
battery's low and I don't know why. But it's plugged in, silly thing.
Oh, so you're concerned about running out of juice, are you, Tracie?
Yeah, but it's plugged in. I don't understand why. But I shall plug it in again.
We can see you and we can hear you very well.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, let's hope that worked now. Let's see. Yes, we seem to have contact. It's plugged in. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Once COVID hit, I got rejected by Socket. I absolutely hit the wall. I think that was the last kick in the guts. I just couldn't take any more rejection. The invalidation was just too much. So I have ill health. Between COVID, but lockdown, having ill health, it was a perfect opportunity to pick up the computer and and try to start where I'd left off countless times. This hasn't been a new thing. I have been writing this book on and off for years, but never ever got, I just deleted as much as more than I actually typed. But this time I just had the flow. I think when you go to have your story and you present your story, and it's like opening Pandora's box, they pick and pick and pick at a wound until you bleed. Then they decide, well, this is just too hard, we don't know what to do with it. You're left bleeding. You're left with all this information in your head that you'd repressed for so long. Now, what do I do with it? So I put it in a book. Warts and all, I didn't hold back. As I said, it's probably not the best written book you'll ever read, but it's written as a conversation. So it starts off from when I was a child. You know, I was given away at 2 weeks old and palmed off to different families. At 2 years old or 3 years old, I was never went back. I never went back to live with my parents. And after that, it sort of just went downhill very fast. And it wasn't until the very end of that book that I realised just what a shocking, brutal life I'd had, from sexual abuse to torture, battered child syndrome, PTSD, borderline personality, suicide attempts. I mean, multiple suicide attempts. And not once did I question why. It was so normal. I just assumed it was the thing to do. Can you see me?
Yep.
Oh, good.
I can see you. Oh, now I can't.
Because you're talking. The person talking will come up on the screen, I think.
You're
Oh,
fine,
well.
Tracie.
Yeah.
The thing is, when you've got someone like my life, it's very hard because I don't fit into the right category. You've got all of yous except for Carolyn, that's either clergy abuse, institutional abuse, and then you've got someone that's sort of out of the box. We're not anything. We're the invisible generation. We don't belong. When they had the Canberra apology to the institutional child sexual abuse, everyone was invited except for us, even though we were technically care leavers. And I've been writing so many submissions to the government in regards to getting voluntary placement survivors recognised. And every now and then they get on board and they promise me everything, especially at election year, and then it just sort of disappears. So I thought, bugger it, I'm just going to, if I kick the bucket tomorrow, I'm going to have the last word. I'll never see justice. So everything that I've ever encountered, no matter how bad it made me look, I've put it in the book. Not one of my family are interested. None of my friends are interested. Every book I've sold has been to strangers. They don't understand why I can't just get over it. It's in the past. What is your problem? Why do you keep dwelling? And it's that constant invalidation that it's just, I think the biggest invalidation I ever got was a few years ago when I spent my whole life thinking, because I was despised. I wasn't hated. I was absolutely despised by my families, the informal foster families. But they always told me I was a ward of the state. Well, at least I felt like, well, at least I was something. So I went to Freedom of Information to apply for my paperwork, only to find out there was no paperwork. They don't know anything about me. The only thing they could suspect is I was a voluntary placement child. And because of that, despite the fact that I had overwhelming evidence of all the atrocities against me, no solicitor would pick up my story because I had no paperwork. And this is wrong on so many levels for care leavers like me. If you look at the government's legislation about what is a care leaver, well, if you were out of care, I was out of care my whole life, but I still am not recognised. And I went on a Forgotten Australians page and I was actually asking if there was anyone else in my position. Well, much to my surprise, no one knew what voluntary placement was. So I cut and pasted the voluntary care itinerary, what is on the government page. And everyone goes, well, I was sent to different families to live. So were my brother and sister. We never really lived anywhere. I said, that's voluntary placement. And they never knew there was an actual word for it. They've just been like me, just palmed from one family to another. So we don't fit in anywhere. So that's what my book's based on, just being fragmented. you just don't belong anywhere, and you're made to be, you're told every day of your life that you're not wanted, you don't belong, it's not your family. Then you find out there is no recognition for you. You don't even have paperwork to prove that you're somebody. So it's that, it's like you're literally nothing. You can't find a place in life. It's hard. It was, people have read my book and can't believe just how sad it is. I wasn't intentionally trying to be sad. It was just the way it was. It was just, when kids are grown up and they're not wanted in an institution, it's bad enough you've got a regime. Well, I might as well have been in an institution because people in my family weren't mentally stable. They couldn't have been for what they'd done to me. And the more they got away with, the worse it got. So I have put everything in the book. I haven't held back anything, including my own flaws, because I can't believe it went on. And obviously I never had any psychiatric help because I didn't see there was a problem. And so many people have identified themselves through this book. They've actually wrote to me and said, I just didn't realise just what I was doing until I read your book, and I realised I was doing the same thing, especially people in very bad marriages. So it's a bit of an odd bod book. It's just one person that's overcome the worst kind of adversity and come out the other end. I now take, I'm a support worker for so many people. I got the Australian of the Year 2020 for my support work. And it's just a story to say that no matter what life, gives you, it's up to you to overcome it. And there's too much in the book to really pinpoint one thing, because it was just about someone that was born in the wrong people at the wrong time and just had to muddle all the way through. So that's it, end of story.
Wow. Thank you, Tracie. Did you feel differently after you wrote the book?
I was disgusted in myself. I'm going to be honest. I was very hard on myself. And that's my problem. I've always been very self-critical, but I couldn't believe that, as I said, that I allowed it to happen. Even while I was writing it, I kept saying, excuse my French, what the fuck was wrong with you? Why did you let them talk to you like this? Why did you let them treat you like this?
Didn't know any better.
Pardon?
You didn't know any better.
Yeah, but when someone is, I even protected. I even had the opportunity. I could have had them jailed and I protected them. And while I was writing, I was thinking, my God, you had the opportunity right there. It could have all stopped. And instead, I didn't want to get them in trouble. I know now, I know all the psychological reasons why, but as a child, you've got no idea what that does to your psyche, to think that one half is protecting them and the other half wants, is like terrified. It's just ridiculous. The system, I don't know. I was just so disgusted in myself. I've got to admit, the book wasn't good for me to write. It was, in some ways, was cathartic, but the rest of it was just like, well, it's your own fault because you let it go on. And I'm talking about right up, even while I was married, I could have done something. And as I said, you're so conditioned, you don't see anything wrong. It's just the way it is, so put up with it. We just mimic our families. Whole different person now, but yeah, it wasn't. Though, it's been good for other people, so that's what it was about. As long as it helps one person, well, it's been worth it.
And it clearly has, from what you've said.
Well, I think the biggest criticisms as I've got is from my family, because they don't understand why. What on earth would make me want to do it? Why would you want to talk about something like that? And I was surprised. I thought my own kids they're proud I wrote a book, but none of them have said, can we see it? Which, my son's 30 and it's like, oh, I don't want to know that side. Please don't talk about it. So I don't mention it. It's like, I've got 2 Facebook pages, one for my support page and one my private. I don't even mention it on my private. No one's even known I've wrote a book. It's like, if it's not clergy abuse, nobody's interested. It's like you've got to be in an exclusive club. As soon as you say it's incest, oh, is that all? I mean, is that all? It's
Incest is fairly huge.
oh, not according to a lot of people, sadly. I don't know why they think it's perfectly acceptable or understandable because it goes on to happen in families, but it shouldn't happen. A priest shouldn't do it. And I said, we were minors. It shouldn't be happening to anyone.
No.
It's amazing people's mentality. It really is.
So if someone like Denise and Frank and Jan, who mentioned that the process of writing allowed some of the pleasures or the, you know, some of the good stuff to come through, that wasn't the same for you?
No, because
there wasn't any good.
No, I don't. Look, funny enough, I was on a podcast. I don't know if you know Narelle Fraser. She's an ex-policewoman who retired for PTSD. She was in it for 30 years. So she now does podcasts. Anyway, she asked me one question, and I can honestly say I've never been stumped in my life. Can you name one happy childhood memory? And I just sat there and went, I didn't realise I was pausing. And I'm like, no. And then I remembered I used to play in a drain, and I didn't actually play in a drain. I escaped in a drain to get away from being abused. And that was my little sanctuary. And that gave me pleasure. And that's the only thing I could remember. And it was then that I realised, damn, things weren't good. But as I said, you're used to it. It's the way you are. It's like if you live with an alcoholic, you don't see anything wrong with it. We're just conditioned, sadly. And then you know those unwritten rules, what you don't talk. And you don't talk for so long, you eventually just never mention it. You repress it so far back. So yeah, it's quite tragic. I didn't realise the extent of my abuse until suddenly, as I said, Pandora's box was open, and one thing, it only takes one memory. I think it was Frank that said it, and suddenly it was just like the gates were open and it was like blur. And suddenly I was remembering everything, whether I wanted to or not. And the same goes when Socket asks you all these questions, they go everywhere. And then when they decide to drop the case for some inexplicable reason, you go in there, and after you've repressed it for so many years and you finally open up, and then you're left with all of this, what do you do with it? Now what? You can't put it back. So all these triggered memories are just overwhelming you, and it's very, very, very tragic. I was in a very, very bad place after that. I just didn't know what to do, and the book helped me that way. It sort of gave me somewhere to vent. What it'll ever do, I don't know, but it gave me the last word, and that's what made me feel good. Regardless of what, they can bury me tomorrow, everyone can deny accountability, but it's there, there's my words, and I can back every word up. That's the difference. But it's just the one thing that stood out the most is how common child abuse is. By the amount of feedback that I've had is just shocking, and how much was covered up and how much is, especially by family, and that's the saddest part. I mean, we talk about institutional abuse. Well, the family is an institution. So how can people not categorise us as care leaders? We were left in a family institution. We weren't left in one family. So why is it we do not qualify as care leaders?
Claim it for yourself, Tracie.
Beg your pardon?
You can claim it for yourself.
Yeah.
You don't have to go by other people's rules about who's in and who's out. Claim it for yourself. And you might, there's on the Care Experience History Month YouTube channel, there's a conversation with Jim Luthi last week, and there's a young woman on there. There was an incest, but she had a very similar experience in terms of the informal kinship care, as we talked, because you're from Victoria, so that voluntary care doesn't always apply in each state. But she was in informal kinship care and parceled around from family to family. And your story, without the incest, reminds me a lot of her story. So you might like to go, and she's younger than you, I think. She's in her 30s now. So you might like to go and have a listen to her story as well.
Well, okay, well, thank you. I'll probably blabbled on about because there's just so much in it. I don't really know where to start. It's one of
Yeah, of
those,
course.
it's just literally from birth, unwanted, growing up as a small child, how many times I was nearly died as a small child, and then being tortured as an older child, and then it just goes on and on to street kids. It just goes on and on, but it just follows my life literally from, I mean, it's a terrible movie, but it's a series of unfortunate events. It's just like if anyone was cursed, it was like I was. And I can honestly say I don't think I've ever met anyone with such bad luck as what I had. It was
Tracie, I
hard.
really hope that one day you will write about what turned you around, because I'm stunned looking at you and listening to you that you had such a shitty childhood. You
It
don't
didn't
look
get any
like
better
that.
as my adulthood either.
Eh?
It didn't get any better as an adult either.
Something did though. I can tell.
That's just me.
Yeah, you write about you.
Uh,
Yeah.
I was. It's easy when you think about somebody. Even when I was writing in the third person, and it goes back to that disassociation. Like I wasn't even feeling like I was writing about myself. I didn't have any emotion when I was talking through socket. I felt like I was ad-libbing and I was talking about somebody else.
Can you
I think I've
explain
done.
what socket is, Tracie? That's unfamiliar to me.
Oh, it's the historical charges for the police,
Okay.
sexual abuse charges. So when the Cardinal Pell, I don't like calling him Cardinal, when the pedo came along, they were really, really pushing for people to do historical charges. So, and they were flooding in. Oh my God, obviously clergy abuse. And it was that moment that I decided, bugger this. I was just so enraged reading those people's comments, and both myself and my cousin both filed statements against, and that's her own brother. 4 people filed statements against him and they were all just swept under the carpet. So a lot of people have gone through socket. I don't know what, I think it's called Socket Across Australia, if I'm not mistaken. It's just historical charges anyway.
It reminds me, Frank, you said that there were some people who didn't like what you had to say. So Tracie, you've talked about how your family weren't happy with what you were writing.
Mm-hmm.
Tracie, Frank, you said something very similar, that there were people who didn't like the way that you spoke about the adults who were looking after your kids.
Yeah, and they fall into 2 categories, I suppose. There were those who had a vested interest in concealing the abuse in the institution I was in, board members and so on. Interestingly, 3 of those have been written off on the roll of honour, president of the board of management, for sexual abuse. One of the superintendents was sacked overnight or just disappeared. So they didn't like it, and the nephew of the matron objected to me describing his aunt, who was matron, as a frightening person. I was entering that institution as an infant, and I was frightened. But he objected to me being frightened. No, he objected to me writing about her as a frightening person. So that was one group of people. The other group of people were my fellow inmates. Not all of them, but some of them, who said, "What are you bleating about? We had a roof over our heads and we got 3 meals a day, and we've turned out all right." And they denied that any abuse took place. I mean, I found it extraordinary, and I found it very difficult to engage in conversation, especially when one of them told me that he hadn't actually read my book, and he wouldn't read a book like that, but he was prepared to criticize it. So you're going to put someone's nose out of joint, because people have got vested interests. Even the former inmates who felt that I was being too harsh, describing staff as cruel and abusive. Yeah, it's just one of those things you put out there. But where I just say I'm honest. I've written my story. You write yours.
Yes.
If you don't like what I've written, you write your version.
Yeah.
What about you, Jan? Because you did have people come forward and ask that you write their story. Did you get any adverse reactions as well?
Yes, I did, from the much older generations of people who'd been there before the Second World War and during the war. Oh no, nobody was there during the war, but before and after. They commented on my ingratitude and said,
Yes.
at least you had a roof over your head and blankets and food. What more do you want? And it sort of leaves you speechless. And then I thought, I wanted to be loved. I wanted my mum or someone who would be like my mum and care for me. That's what I wanted. You can keep your blankets and your roof and your food. I just want to be loved and respected. Thank you. And that particular woman used to shut anybody up at reunions who spoke the way I spoke in the book. But then there were lots of people who gave really positive feedback, including my sister who read it and chain smoked and cried the whole way through. And she said, I'm so glad somebody's written this at last. And that reflects the attitudes of most people who've read it. But yeah, the older generations seem to be more along the lines of you should have been grateful that you were looked after. That kind of thing.
Was it similar, Jan, when you brought out the book with the anthology of stories about Burnside?
No, I haven't heard much about that from other people. I know, again, some of the older people were told by that particular woman, she just wants to make money out of your misery. Don't put your story in it. So that's why I'm a millionaire, because I made millions out of that book, as we all did, didn't we? No, but I haven't had a lot of feedback about that. But I know the families of the people in the book are really pleased.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I often hear that thing about, you're just making a claim against the church or against the state because you want to make money out of it rather than paying attention to the person's concern. And that other one of gratitude as well seems to be universal.
Can I just say something?
Sure.
The one thing I've found is because I had to self-publish, I've tried to get my local community to allow me to do talks, or the library, the bookshop. Nobody will pick up a self-published person for a start. They don't promote self-published speakers, and nobody wants to hear about the topic.
Yeah.
And I
Very true.
wonder why nothing improves in life.
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, these people get away with murder because there's people who are still enabling it by hiding it.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest problem too with my book is it's intergenerational, and I clearly point that out. When something happens for so many generations, it becomes the norm for them, and they've all hidden it for so long that, these people all go to parties together. The mind boggles. But until people like us keep putting it out there and say, well, this is what happened and we're not going to take it, we want it to be out. We want everyone to know that these atrocities did happen through no fault of our own, then it's going to keep getting hidden. And we have to talk uncomfortable truths.
Yeah. And there are people.
Sorry?
There are people who believe that the broader community does not need to know about all these awful things that happen to children. Yeah. People have said when I wrote the stories of the men who were in the pedophile rings, why do we have to know about that? And I think we have to know about that so we can stop that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's the important thing, so that we can stop it.
Good on you, Tracie, I wish to say. Good on you for writing it.
I think as long as people can turn around and say, well, I don't like what you wrote, but at least you can say it like Frank said, it is 100% honest. It's raw. I don't whitewash anything, and I don't try to make excuses for either them or myself. I just literally state facts as they happened.
Yes, yes.
without trying to embellish it and give reasons, you know, like where a lot of people go wrong, they over justify everything. And I don't think people need to hear that. They just want to hear, I went to the shop, brought milk and came back.
Yeah.
My context is quite different from yours, Tracie. You know,
Yeah, but you're a writer, I'm not.
Oh no, I'm not. I'm not thinking. I'm thinking about the actual historical context. You know, growing up in a 200 child institution is different from your experience of being shunted around in small family circles. What's the point I was going to make? I think it's important to understand that. It was important for me to understand that it wasn't my fault. I mean, it took me years to realize that it wasn't my fault. I didn't choose my parents. I didn't choose the situation I was in. I didn't understand the situation I was in, let alone chose to be there. And I think that's probably true for you, notwithstanding the different contexts. And so I've always taken the view that to blame yourself or to feel that somehow or other you're guilty of some offence in your childhood is just preposterous. And so that enables me to stand back a bit and analyse it probably in a colder way than you do. You know, emotion is not my strength. We learnt not to show emotions as children in those institutions, and no doubt you felt that even in the smaller family institution, and I agree with you, family is an institution, but in a large institution, if you showed your emotions as a male, well, they gave you something to cry about. And so it took me a long time to actually come to that conclusion that I could actually write as an historian would write, as a detached person would write. But I did it with the underpinning that I understood clearly it was not my fault.
Yeah.
I had done nothing wrong. I had nothing to be ashamed of. And that gives you that liberates you in a way to able to write the facts and feel that you're not opening yourself up to criticism, judgment, censure, notwithstanding what I said before about some of the readers who gave me a bit of a hard time. You know, by and large, it's positively received. And I've had many more people have said, you wrote the truth than you told lies.
Yeah.
I think what it does too, like with my book, it shows you just how damaging unhealed trauma is. Because I'd never dealt with it, I didn't recognise it as trauma. It was just what it was. And I just coped any way I could. I was in survival mode. And it wasn't until I finished writing that book that I realised just how many obstacles I had overcome, which were just abnormal.
Yeah.
But each time I told the story, like I'd tell a story about one of my aunties torturing me, I would also go on to at the end say, well, you know, many years later I had to find out why she was so fucked in the head was because she was sexually abused as well. And I'd always give that. And then I felt like, was I justifying that? You know, like it was, but I just wanted to state the fact that she had her own demons as well that were never dealt with. So everyone has demons. And unfortunately, the whole book is about unhealed trauma. Pure and simple. What happens? I mean, what do they say? Child abuse casts a shadow a lifetime. And that's true.
Yeah. It is true. Yeah. I mean, I think the only reason I got away with not being judged was because I wrote it from the voice of a child. I actually just laid it out there as a child. I am experiencing this. This is what I'm feeling. This is what happens. And I wasn't speaking from a voice of judgment from the older person. So I think it was most of people that read my book kind of got it for some reason. And I was surprised I didn't get more criticism. There was only one person, oh, well, at the end, at least you gave some balance. that was my journey. That was my journey, you know, that I could actually see that the nuns were traumatized women themselves, that they had their own demons, as you say. But I didn't those demons. I guess I just laid it bare the way that it was. So I'm surprised I didn't get more judgment. I guess there were people that said, oh, I couldn't even pick that book up and read it because it's all about trauma. I couldn't even begin to read that book, you know, because it would make me feel terrible. I said, well, okay, understand. Some can't read that stuff. They can't cope with it. You know, they're not ready. They're not ready to hear that stuff. Yeah. But I can see you still fought with your PS, even though you're healing.
My brain's ticking over now. I think the hardest part too as a child is I was 6 people. My mother had 6 kids, or she had 2 immediately after she gave me. She kept them all, but just didn't want me. And I think growing up, the damage that causes being because I was my father's last child, and she couldn't stand it. She couldn't stand the know that I was his last kid, so she just punished me. And my whole life, that's all I was told is I was an abortion gone wrong. So that's how you grow up thinking. Nice. So it's people don't realise what the child abuse, physical abuse stops, but it's what you do with all that information once it comes out.
Yes, it's psychological. I know it takes a lot of processing, processing.
Well, you don't process it when you're growing up, though, because as I said,
no,
you don't. No,
but you need to be processing that now as you are. You know, you will keep asking yourself, you will process things, and if you can get help and support processing. Oh, that's not true. You can get at least 5 you can get 5 sessions referred each year through Medicare.
I went to one psychologist once, and the stupid woman told me to tell my womb I'd loved it.
You might need to choose. You might need to choose your therapist.
Yes, I think so.
Check them out first.
Yeah, but actually, funny you should say that. I'll get your email address later, and I'll send you something about a story that I wrote about having a hysterectomy.
Well, that's a funny thing. I'd had a hysterectomy, and I said, "Yeah, I mean, some of them." And I
loved it before it went.
No, the idea is to tell your inner child and start with the womb. I said, but I had a hysterectomy. She goes, pretend. I said, but I can't because I'm a pragmatist. I just didn't make sense. And I thought, oh my God, why do I get these fruitcakes? The last one was a bloody dog person, her fur babies. I thought it must be just me. So no, I don't do therapy. I do life.
You can shop around though if you want to.
You just need to find the right person
for you. Yeah, because that fur baby person will be great for someone else.
But let's be honest. I mean, what are they going to say to me? I'm 60 years old. They're going to turn around and tell me these are the 20-odd-year-old that have only ever run out of shampoo. That's their biggest crisis. And they're going to look at me and give me some life experience.
No, it's not that simple. Not that simple. No. You just need the right people to be there with you.
Survive now. I'm over. It's done. It's all the words on earth are not going to. It's not going to undo what's done. That's my attitude.
No. It's not going to undo.
Well, that's true.
It's not going to undo.
It's not going to undo all the damage. All I can do now is just do what I can with the information, which I'm doing. I'm helping other people. I don't dwell on it. I don't do, oh, poor is me. It's just, and I am my own best therapist because I've come so far because of my attitude. I don't like therapists. I think most of them, I've yet to see one that's can even, I end up turning it back on them. I end up psychoanalyzing them. I had one and we ended up transferring it onto her trip to Prague, and she didn't even realise for an hour. She was telling me she was bike riding through Prague. I'm very good at transference.
All right.
Yes, I know you don't agree. I can see by your face.
Okay, so Frank, you've definitely mentioned that you think that writing is very helpful. Jan, would you say similarly that you think it's a helpful process for something you'd recommend to other care leavers?
Yes, I definitely would, with the proviso that you have support people who are there for you if you crack up while you're doing it, and bring you back to the reality of who you are now. I think it's a wonderful thing to do, to write your story.
That's a great proviso though too. Yeah, fantastic. And Denise, you?
Yeah, I would say that it's been quite quick after I finished my book. For me, I processed a lot as I went, and I did get support as I went. So that was the difference. I didn't realise, I guess, you know, for the lack of mother, that was my problem. For the lack of mother, I developed surrogate mothers along the way, my journey, and surrogate support people. And I go back to the idea that a lot of care leavers still need mentors and people that understand them and that help them, that support that they need at that particular time. So, you know, it's necessary to have that. I mean, like I said, I had a meltdown for 13 years where I couldn't go back and do my writing because it was so traumatic and I was stuck. But I was getting therapy, even though I could write it. And yeah, it wasn't until, but definitely I didn't get I wasn't with psychologists. A lot of the time I was with people called emotional release counsellors. They were, they're not the typical psychology people, very different. Yeah, so I believe you need all care leavers and people who have grown up without having the proper care as a child need that support and nurturing to help build themselves again from what they've lost. One of the biggest things for me was that self-criticism, the lack of self-love, and the really hard one is to find self-respect and self-love out of all the things that we see and all the things that we felt that we enabled ourselves to tolerate and put up with. Like Frank says, it wasn't our fault. We were young, we were children, we knew no better. But we need that support as we get on. And even now, like, you know, Tracie, you're 60. You still got a lot of life left to, I hope you enjoy, and that it's not just with demons. I really hope it's not, for your sake. I really hope you can find happiness, joy and freedom, lots of love and a lot less criticism. You don't deserve criticism.
When I say about therapists, I better just clarify that. I mean, by all means, I do not say people don't go to therapists. I'm just saying in my case. So as long as, you know, understand
Yeah,
that.
no, I understood that.
Yeah, I
get
thought,
you
God,
too.
I hope people
I
don't
get you
think I'm...
too.
I guess we all do we all do what we need to do, I think.
You do what works for you.
Yeah, exactly. So we probably should start winding up. So maybe we'll just go around and see if anybody's got any concluding comments that they'd like to make. And since you went last before Tracie, maybe you go first this time.
I just think the one thing I hope this message comes across is that even the most broken can be mended. And I think looking around at all these wonderful people, it just shows you the resilience that the human being has, you know, like it's just incredible. And I just feel very honoured to be amongst all of you. I feel a bit of a fraud being here, but yeah, I think well done, everyone. You're going to send out a wonderful message to a lot of people. Be prepared to be flooded.
Thanks, Tracie. Thank you. Denise?
Yeah, I'd just like to respond to Tracie again and say you're not a fraud. I am glad to raise the awareness with me that you had the experience that you had and that you're not, I want you to claim being a care leaver. I'm claiming you and my sister as a care leaver now, okay?
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. And I do believe that there is a lot in the journey of writing. You definitely need support. This Roundtable, it's almost like I don't know how we could facilitate having writers' roundtables where we could just talk about some of this process as we go through and what we need to help us get through and
We need
ways
a
that we can do
conference.
it. Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, and yeah, and we need those mentors. We need mentors with us. We need mentors and support.
Fantastic.
Can't keep doing everything on your own.
It's a good point. Thank you, Denise. And Frank?
I guess this last half hour's conversation is in my head is how lucky I am to be an historian. I was trained as a historian, taught history, and now I've come back to it in a more rigorous way. And what that does to me is it enables me to distance myself from the harsh emotions, the cruelty, and that real bitchy life that you talk about, Tracie. Distance myself and say, I can't change the past. It wasn't my doing, but what I can do is actually learn from the past and actually move on so that I can show that I'm actually as good as any other historian. I'm just as good as any other father. I'm just as good as any other human being who hopes that the Labor government gets in this time round. I'm just the past is only there. You can't change it. It's only there so that you can actually learn something from it and take it forward. And so I talk about the present being the future. If you can do the present well, your future's going to be all right.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And Jan?
Yes, well, my head's spinning. I've really enjoyed listening to all of us talking, and two things come to mind up front. One is that I had a cousin who is now deceased, who had a very privileged upbringing, and she was very supported and protected by her parents. And I'm more grateful for my life than I would have been if I'd had hers, because I know so much more about so many different things than somebody with a sheltered, privileged life had. And I think she felt that too before she died, because she was too protected. And the other thing that comes to mind is possibly a little bit off topic, but the two men who I wrote for, the pedophile victims, are illiterate. And I want to encourage anybody who can do it to help illiterate people get their stories written, to do it. Buy a little voice recorder and just get them to talk and talk and talk. And it's good for them. And yeah, I see Carolyn nodding. It's the same as what you did with your dad, of course. And so if anybody listens to this and has a spare 6 months in their life so they could help somebody, go to a Wattle Place or D or somebody, and there's hundreds of people out there who'd want you, I think. Lots of other things are in my mind, but I'll stop now.
Fantastic, thank you. And Caroline, you have been listening to all of us. Is there any comment that you'd like to make on the conversation?
One, I want to say thank you so much, guys, for allowing me to be here. And I can relate to little bits of what you've all been saying, because, you know, through the journey that I had with my dad of helping to write his memoirs, a big part of his life at the beginning was very similar to Tracie's story as well. And I've just read Tracie's story, and so a lot's related back. And I know that one of the things I did with my dad as I was writing his book is I just went up to him one day and gave him a big cuddle, because I realised that he never had anybody give him, sit him on their knee and read him a story. Because it only came through the loudspeaker while he was in the home. And he never had that feeling of being loved and supported. He was always, you know, a survivor on his own, just trying to make things happen. And he had 4 siblings, and they all lived very separate lifestyles. And one of the things that came out of the book when Dad finished writing his part of it was that there was many people that had read it in the family that said, why would you write such rubbish? Why would you want to do anything like this? This isn't true. This is thing. And what we realised is that this is Dad's story. It wasn't their story. It was Dad's story, and it's been written in the way he would express himself. And I remember Dad and me sort of talking to members of the family who were really traumatised by his story because they didn't like what he wrote. If you got your own story, you need to write your own story. But this was Dad's story, and that was the one thing that I've sort of pulled back on. And I think that was one of the reasons why after he passed, I couldn't finish the story straight away, because I found I had a lot of people in my family literally attacking me for the way Dad wrote his story. But I encouraged Dad to write the story the way he saw fit, the way he wanted the words to be said, as a little bit like Tracie. He wanted to have the last say. He wanted people to know this is what happened and this is the way it happened. And being his daughter and as a legacy to him, I want to make sure that still happens. One of the reasons I'm so interested in what was going on tonight was because I've been in this little bit of a conflict of how do I put this story out there without upsetting everybody?
Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm realising that now.
Someone's
And-
always going to be upset.
Exactly. Just say what I said at the start of mine. I make no
I've found a bit of a
apologies.
support network for myself.
Yes,
Exactly.
yes, good
Yeah.
idea.
So I can relate to a lot of what you guys have been saying. And I just really appreciate the fact that I've been here, and I'm really glad that I took the initiative to say, you know, poke a little bit more and say, look, I want to be a little bit, find out a little bit more about how your journey was, how you went about writing your stories, because this has now given me more of an incentive to make sure I finish Dad's story, you know, and do it well. So thank you.
Sonia.
That sounds fantastic. Thank you. And thank you all for tonight. I feel as if it's kind of the
Yeah.
beginning of a conversation rather than the end of a conversation when we finish up. So hopefully we can get together and maybe have a conference, but certainly speak to some other people in the community as well.